Okay, I want to look at classic binding theory. So in the textbook, there are two versions of binding theory that are presented, and so I started out doing the one that is called Helen's theory, or something like that. It's basically what I'm calling that is the co-argument binding theory, because it depends on identifying arguments. Whereas this one is looking at the syntactic structure. So the hypothesis is that reflexive and pronominal anaphora, which we know are constrained in some way by the syntax, are totally constrained by the syntax is the hypothesis here. And the actual configuration of the tree is what's going to matter, or that's going to be one of the things that matters. But at the same time, you'll see that in order to do this, it's a fairly complicated theory. It's going to have to look at some level at arguments, because it's going to be looking for governors of things, and the governors of things are going to be the things that in general, something that governs something else. So in the verb trust governs the DP Jerry here. Because why? Well, because we say it does. That's a certain syntactic configuration. But what is that syntactic configuration? It's the syntactic configuration of a head and its complement. Those two things there's a government relationship between the head and the complement. So notice that we have these it's going to be stated in terms of governing categories, but that's what I'm saying is that's a disguised way of really talking about arguments at some level. But this was done at a time when there was no representation of clause structure. With, I guess what's missing here, it won't matter here, but at the time that this theory was created, Elaine would not have started out in the VP. That was a development that came fairly late in the overall transformational grammar theory. So you wouldn't have had them as being, the arguments of verb wouldn't be necessarily thought of as being projected into certain slots. In order to get things to work, different moves had to be made. So the idea of governing category is related ultimately to the notion of co-argument in some way, but it's not exactly the same. And then it's going to work in terms, so the binding thing, so this is where the notion of binding theory comes from here. Chomsky made up this idea of government and binding. The theory became known as government and binding theory because it was after this, after getting an account of pronominal and reflexive anaphora phenomena in language. And in so doing, to build then a model that would work for, same model would then work for saying, what is it that can move in a tree? And that's going to be subject to the same principles. That was the overreaching goal of the theory. So, and so it's a kind of complicated thing, but it's not all that complicated. Something binds something else. If they are arguments of something, doesn't care of what. All it cares is that they're arguments of something, and that would be true of DPs in general, right? DPs are going to be arguments of a verb or of a preposition or something. And then the key thing here, this has been a critical notion throughout the theory of syntax. The relationship of C command has to hold. So we'll go through that a little bit carefully. Now, this is why we have to have all of the notions that we looked at earlier and that we've been talking about in play here, dominating and all of that kind of stuff, right? So there's a tree configuration where nodes are in relationships with each other, and one kind of relationship that has played a critical role has been that of command of some sort. And then command has been that basic notion that goes all the way back. Actually, the notion command goes back for this phenomenon, for reflexive and pronominal anaphora, all the way back to the early 1970s when the first theory said something about commanding have to be, that's a notion that has to do with being in the same clause and being in a relationship of some kind of relationship of dominance. But C command is is a much more specific notion than that. So we have to understand what that is. So, but it's not really all that hard. A C commands B if and only if the first branching node dominating A also dominates B. So if I want to know if I C command something, I look up to the first branching node above me, and then I see everything else that's under that node. Everything else in there is in my C command domain. So, so if we look here, we got Kramer up there. There's a DP. So all we're really caring about is the DPs. So Kramer is a DP up there, and its C commands the position that the DP Elaine is in. Because why? We look at Kramer, the whole thing, right? We're not worried about the stuff inside of there. We're going to be taking whole DPs. And we're going to be worrying about, so you would have an index for that, because that whole DP, however complex it may be, will get its value from some person in the world or for something in the world. And that's what the index is on it, saying, I have a referential value. I refer to something. So things that are code-indexed, remember, are going to have the same value. They're going to have the same referential value. Or they're going to have, in the case of traces, they're just elements of the same thing. They're places where I have been. And so places where I've been will have my index as well, right? But that would be true. So we're worried about co-indexing, but we're also worried about C command. And C command is fairly simple again. I look up at the first branching node dominating me. I C command everything else in that that is dominated by that node. So remember the notion of dominate, right? Everything under the IP, that IP1 node, all of that is dominated by that IP1 node. So that means that Kramer basically then C commands everything in that IP because Kramer, so the things that are higher up in the tree in general are going to be C commanding things lower down in the tree. So Kramer also C commands Jerry, right? Okay, so that's the configuration. The one big part of it is the C command domains. And the notion of govern is also defined in terms of C command, so it gets used all over the place. So if a head governs something that it C commands, right? And that it is in a closer relationship. So you can actually just state it in terms of sister, because the closer relationship would be roughly that of sister. Not exactly. So Elaine C commands Jerry as well, right? Because I look up, I find the first branching node above me, that's the IP2, and the DP consisting of Jerry is in that C command domain. And then with the harder one, so C command is really fairly easy, but the governing category is the hairy one. So the governing category is the first dominating IP or DP. I'm going to limit myself to that, right? And there's a reason for this. I mean, and it's a reason that we've already examined at some level. We've said that from a later version of the theory that there are these certain kinds of functional shells, and one kind, the IP, and another kind, the DP, are very, very similar. and they can both have subjects and all of that kind of stuff. So they have a very similar structure all the way across them. So this is going to be these are the key nodes that you have to look for in order to determine the governing category. So the governing category for A, anything, is the first dominating IP or DP containing a governing head and an accessible subject. So there's a lot of stuff packed in there, right? But basically, we're going to be looking for the first IP or DP node above us, and then we're going to see if there's a governing head. And this is where, I mean, this is just a stupid theory, right? Accessible subject has to be defined in this really, really crazy way, because it's basically going to be saying you're an accessible, leaving aside the accessible part, it's going to be defining subject as ordinary subject and the I node for whatever reason. It had to be done this way. Chomsky thought this stuff out. He must have had some graduate students helping him, but they must have been pretty lame. And then so it's going to be looking for an accessible subject if and only if A is a specifier in an IP or DP containing blah, 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 and A does not itself contain B, or A is a tensed I governor of B. So I'll walk you through this so you get a sense of what it's all about. Jerry's governing category is this. It's going to generally be the clause, the first clause above you. That's generally going to be the case, because we're looking for the first IP or DP above us. And then we're going to have to make sure that it has a governor. So the first dominating IP is that one. We look and see, is there a governor? Yeah, well, if you're an object of a verb, you're going to have a governor. If you're an object of a preposition, you're going to have a governor. The harder one to get a governor for is the subject. So, so we're looking at Jerry here. So Jerry has an accessible subject because there is a specifier of an IP that contains Jerry. The IP that contains Jerry has a subject. Then we've got an accessible subject. It would only not be accessible under a very, very weird set of circumstances. That is where if Jerry were contained inside of that DP, that is the subject for that category, then Jerry wouldn't be an accessible subject. I can't, so basically saying, nothing can be an accessible subject for me if I'm contained in it. Right? Does that make sense? It's sort of it's the complicated shit, right? Well, I mean, you'll see why it's this way. It's this way for good reason. Okay, so we look at Elaine. Elaine needs to have a first dominating IP. It's got that. Now we say that I governs the infil node, the place where the tense is, the head of the whole clause, governs the subject position. So that's just by declaration. I is a governor for specifier of IP. V is a governor for its complements. So you can be a governor for your complements, or in some cases for the specifier idea, right? So you can see that you couldn't quite do this in terms of arguments back in those days, because Elaine is not an argument of info. Not a possible thing to do. So that's why this other route had to be taken, and why the co-argument thing is more sensible at some level. Okay, so that's the idea. We've got governing category, and that I is an accessible subject for that DP, because there's not one contained within the other, and we're just saying that I's can be subjects. And well, the idea here is that in full, there was some kind of logic like this. Well, in full, we just need it to be this way in order to get the whole thing to work. But also, info will typically have subject agreement properties in it. That's where the subject agreement goes, right? And subject agreement in many languages is all that you would have to indicate what the subject is. And so there's a sense in which those two things are closely linked. Those are subjects. in some sense. Okay, so can we put he here? Yeah, that's okay. Why? Because the governing category for that position is the embedded clause, because it has all the things that it needs to be defined as a governing category, right? And then we look at the binding principles, and their principle B says this is an ordinary pronoun. An ordinary pronoun cannot be bound in its governing category. What that means is, translate that, can't have its antecedent be something that C commands it, because you only bind something if you C command it, and be in the same governing category. So there is something, the antecedent of he is Kramer, and it doesn't matter which one we point to here, because the trace of Kramer and Kramer all add up to the same thing, right? Neither one of those things will be able to do the binding if there's a binding violation, right? So keep that in mind. The trace, the DP itself, all one thing with respect to binding. So we just look at the trace there of Kramer, and it binds, that trace does bind he. It binds that pronoun, but that pronoun is not bound within the governing category. It's the thing that binds it is outside the governing category. That's fine, not a problem at all. A pronoun doesn't need to have a binder. Perfectly fine without one. If it has a binder, that binder cannot be in its governing category. That's the way it works. Yeah.
How do we define governing?
If you're, just think of it this way. Oh, I didn't put that in here, right? Okay, so here's how it works. This is all you really need to know. If I'm a verb, I govern my complements. I govern my sisters, because that's all so the theory is. Oh, if you're an argument of a verb, you have to be one of its sisters, right? Let's take that as the place in the theory that we're at. At the time that Chomsky made this theory, that's the way it worked, by declaration of his, that you govern something if it's a sister of you. Right? You're a head, you have complements, they're going to be your sisters, you govern those. That's all that you need to know, right? The only place where that is different is only with I. I gets to govern the specifier position. Basically it, right? A preposition would have complements. It would govern its complements, right? Okay, so yeah, it's all kind of complicated. Himself wouldn't go here because it needs to be bound within its governing category, and it's not, right? So pronouns and reflexes will be in complementary distribution in general. Where we're going to go with this, by the way, is that, so what I'm trying to develop here is, okay, we have a pretty good understanding of binding. We're going to have binding to we're blue in the face, right? Too much binding, right? And then we're going to look at a problem case where neither version of the binding theory seems to work. And then we're going to flesh out a solution that will require taking us to another level of abstraction in theory. So we're building up slowly to a place where we can see how it was that we made the rationalizations that we did in order to get to some place that seems pretty strange. And if you just went there right from the start, you'd say, whoa, dude, you gotta be kidding, right? So we have to do it fairly slowly and carefully. And hopefully I'll be able to pull this off, right? So that's the idea. So it's actually, once you see, and then he himself is okay, but remember we'll say, well, what the heck is this he himself? Presumably not a reflexive pronoun. If it were a reflexive pronoun, it would not be bound within its governing category, right? So it's something else, what we're gonna have to say, right? Some other kind of thing. You could say it's a pronoun. The strange thing about it is that if it's a pronoun, it has very, very tight constraints on where it can occur. But we'll leave that problem aside. Okay, so if we put her in this slot, Kramer knows this is going to be straightforward, right? We're going to get the right results in general. They're going to say if you're clause mates, well then, and you're going to be, one of them is going to be reflexive. If they're not clause mates, then it's going to be a pronoun, basically, right? Clause mate being contained in the same IP. Because governing category in general will be the first S node, the first clause node, first IP above you will be your governing category, right? Okay, so this is not okay here because it's bound, co-indexed, and Elaine C commands. The DP consisting of Elaine C commands everything in the IP2, right? So that means that there is binding occurring here. And binding cannot occur here because of principle B. Herself, on the other hand, is okay. That's what we expect because, well, herself is bound. And if we've got one of these reflexive pronouns, it needs to be bound in its governing category, and so we're all fine, right? And him is okay here too, because why? Well, him is bound because Kramer C commands him. C commands the pronoun him all the way down in the embedded clause there. But it does, and so there's a binding relationship that occurs there. But him is okay with that. I can be bound. I just don't want it to be, my binder cannot be in the same governing category, in my governing category. So, so we account for all that. And himself is out because it's bound, but not within its governing category. So so far, governing category just looks like clause, right? So there's a reason why it's more complex, and the reason is to get stuff that we've already looked at in the other theory. Okay, so Kramer expects Elaine to trust herself. That's okay, same thing, right? We've got it now here. We've just got an infinitival scenario, right? And that's not okay because that's the pronoun is in the governing. It's binder. It's bound by Elaine. Her is bound by Elaine. So remember, I'm putting imagine that pronoun going down into that slot in the tree. And since we have the pronoun bound in its governing category, it's no good. And himself. So everything. Kramer, yeah, this is no good, right? Kramer expects Elaine to trust himself, horrible, right? Because that's what we expect. Kramer expects Elaine to trust Jerry. Let's take this situation. What is the first dominating IP node is this, right? And there's a governor. But there's no accessible subject, right? Because, why? What was accessible subject? Do I have the definition up there? It has to be a tense die, right? It's not just any I, it has to be a tense die. Why does that have to be a tense die? Because of that situation, right? If I'm an infinitival clause, remember what the basic facts are is that infinitival complements allow a NAFR to go up higher, and they change the governing category. So since I don't have a tense die, then I don't have an accessible subject. Therefore, I have to look up higher. So I go up to the next IP node, right? So it's complicated, right? Well, around, well, I've got to have a governor. I've got a governor, 2 governs me, but it's not an accessible subject because it's not a tense die. Therefore, I go up to the IP node above that, and that does have a tense die. And then we also have to say that expects governs Elaine, right? So just like we did before, no different. We're going to say, well, there's one other case of government. In general, it's your complement. But this was called exceptional case marking because the governors assign the cases as well, right? So in full, if it's tense, assigns nominative. Verbs assign accusative. But this one we know is accusative. It's got to get its case from expects. How does it get its case from expects? Expects governs it and gives that DP, it's complicated stuff, right? Gives that DP its case and therefore governs it, and therefore the governing category is what's shown in the red box for Elaine. So if I'm the subject of an infinitive clause, I'm actually not looking at my semantic co-arguments for my possible binders. I'm looking and the domain in which I can be bound. I look up to the next clause. That's what this is saying, right? So all of those complicated definitions are adding up to giving us this that we know we need to do in some way, no matter what. A tense style governor, right? Got to have that. Okay, so we find that there is an accessible subject if we look up the tree and to the next dominating IIP, and so that's the governing category. And so himself should be able to go here, and it can, right? Him should not be able to go here, and it can't. Kramer expects him to trust Jerry. Where do you mean? Where they're co-indexed? No, no way. All right. Now, one of the reasons C command, so here's the reason C command was used, or one of the reasons. We have to have binding in terms of C command because of what happens in situations like this. So we've made it a little bit more complicated now. Right? Kramer's mailman expects, right? That guy's, what's this guy's name? Newman. Newman. Maybe we don't know Newman, right? We just know that it's Kramer. Like I couldn't remember it off the top of my head. Kramer's mailman expects someone to trust Jerry, right? That's the situation. And so now we look here and we're looking for, can we have this be himself in this case? Kramer's mailman expects himself to trust Jerry. That's a good sentence, right? But it would only be the case if himself is getting its value from Newman. Himself cannot get its value from Kramer, right? That's the key observation, right? So it's not just being in the same clause, it's being in the same clause or in the same governing category and being in a C command relationship, right? That matters, right? So himself here is not bound by anything, is the problem. Because we have to have C command. If without C command, binding fails. So the C command domain of Kramer is the DP. Because Kramer, that DP just looks up for the first branching node above it, and it only C commands the things within that. So the C command domain of a DP contained inside of another DP will be relatively small in general. Can we have him here? Going with Kramer. Fine, right? Why can it be? Why is it fine? It's the converse of this situation with the reflexive, right? On him, I just have to not be bound. I've got something in my governing category that I'm co-indexed with, but it doesn't C command me, therefore I'm not bound by it, right? Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. We didn't do that with co-argument binding theory, but it would work in a similar fashion. Okay, so so you can see that in order to account for all of these relatively complex facts, you need a fairly complex binding theory, depending on how you draw the tree structures, of course. And if you don't use tree structures at all, then you've got a new ballgame to play because you have to be able to account for these things. Okay, so we have Kramer's mailman, Newman, knows that, and then here's a sort of one of these classes. We looked at these with the co-argument binding things as well. We've got a situation where we've got, and it seems to work really good with, in fact, these came to be known as pictured noun phrases. So lots and lots of work was done on looking at how you account for reflexive anaphora inside of these pictured noun phrases. It doesn't have to be just the noun picture, but that's a kind of noun that opens up this possibility very easily. So here we've got a situation where Jerry, in a swimsuit, if we assume that we've got a structure like we've been saying that, let's assume that we have Jerry in a swimsuit is a small clause. Because we know it's a constituent of some kind, and that whole thing is an argument of picture. So picture has a PP complement headed by of, and the DP down inside of there is itself a small clause of some kind. So we've got, so that's the basic idea here. And then we have to know then what the governing category is for Jerry. Did my show stop working? I don't know what happened. It's weird. Okay, so the governing category for Jerry is going to be this because, no, it's not going to be this. It can't be this, right? First dominating DP. We look there, we see if we've got a governor. We've got a first dominating DP and a governor, but the key thing here is that we don't have any accessible subject. Jerry is itself the subject, and there's no tensed I node, right? So therefore, we're going to have to look further. That can't be the governing category. So then we look up to the next IP node, right? You can see what the game is now. We're going to look, find, where's our governing category? And we've got here now, we've got a dominating IP. We're looking at the first one that contains a governor and an accessible subject. And in this case, that there is no accessible subject. Now, the reason that there is no accessible subject is that the I node, is it a tensed I node? It's a tensed I node, but if it were a tensed I, so it's a tensed I node. If that were, in order for that to be a subject, it would have to be co-indexed with the whole DP. If it were co-indexed with the whole DP, then the accessible subject for what we're looking for, the subject that we're looking at as possibly potential would have to be what? The whole DP, because the whole DP is co-indexed with the tensed info. So, and so there's a complicated, some goes to say, well, that's because of it calls it the I within I condition, and so if my index is the same as as the info, the info and the DP have the same index, and so therefore anything contained within a DP that is co-indexed with the info that is the potential accessible subject crashes, doesn't work, right? So that's the bottom line. If I am the whole DP, then I can have the info as my accessible subject. If I'm contained within that DP, then neither the DP itself nor the info that co-indexes it can possibly be an accessible subject. Crazy stuff, right? Accessible subject is, you can see why you want to look for a different theory. But that was the idea. So a DP is not an accessible subject for any DP that it contains. And the info that is co-indexed with the DP has the same value, and so therefore it crashes by the same principle. So therefore we have to look up higher. And we look up higher, and we get Kramer's mailman knows that picture goes. So the governing category here, we see, well, yeah, we've got a governor in this. Have we got an accessible subject? So we've got to look up to the next dominating IP. Do we have an accessible subject? Yes. There's an accessible subject up there, right? So now, because I'm not contained within that, and and I don't even have to look at the info node. All right, so so you see what we've done, right? We've made it possible under certain circumstances to have the governing category be way big, right? But it requires a fairly complex set of circumstances where you have a DP inside of another one and so forth. Okay, so the governing category is this, and then we make certain predictions and we see if they're true. So let's say we want this to be Newman. This is what we're thinking is that Newman knows that a picture of Newman wouldn't shock in a swimsuit, wouldn't shock in a bikini, probably is what we should use. Wouldn't shock Elaine, right? So that's what we want to try, right? And that's okay, right? Newman, Kramer's mailman knows that a picture of himself in a swimsuit wouldn't shock Elaine. Seems to be okay, right? So notice we've done some magic here, right? And you see why the theory is really complicated, right? In order to be able to have that be okay, this kind of story had to be spun out with these complicated accessible subjects and with an eye condition that I didn't actually give you, but I explained it to you. Gives us, well, so now we have some kind of story here. Right? Because it was a problem, right? How are we going to get these? We know that there are these long distance reflexive scenarios in English, right? Where you look outside of the clause that's containing you to find your reflexive, and you look outside to find the thing that, but it's also okay to have him here, right? Kramer's mailman knows that a picture of him in a swimsuit wouldn't shock Elaine. It could go either way, right? Well, why? Because do we predict this? No, we actually don't even predict that, right? So we've got a problem here that classic binding theory doesn't handle. Him is bound in its governing category in apparent violation of principle B. So what do we need to do? So in fact, there's a solution, but it's like even makes the thing even scarier, right? Because you have to say something different about pronouns. It has to be a more complicated statement that you have. I won't go into it. I just want to show you that there are problems here, right? So how about if we put Kramer down here? We're worried about Kramer in a swimsuit. And how would that look would that shock Elaine? Kramer in a bikini? Well, then, but we have to look at the scenario here. So we've got him is all right there. Well, we expect that to be all right, right? So Kramer's mailman knows that a picture of him in a swimsuit, that could go with Kramer, couldn't it? Can we put himself in here, though? No, so we get that right. So it isn't like you can just go and pick up anything from outside the clause. There's some kind of constraint here, right? You can't say, right? You can say Kramer's mailman knows that a picture of himself in a swimsuit You have to be understanding that as himself getting its value from the whole DP Kramer's memo. Has to be Newman, right? Cannot be Kramer. So that works because there's no C-command relation. The C-command domain of Kramer is the DP in which it's contained. Okay. So now let's try something else, right? All of a sudden, if we change it from Kramer's mailman to fix the sentence in such a way, it seems to be okay to do this, right? Kramer's hope is that a picture of himself in a swimsuit will please Elaine. That seems okay, right? So why is that okay, right? So we got another problem, right? So here, classic binding theory fails again because himself isn't bound in its governing category. Why isn't it bound? It's got an antecedent in the governing category, right? But it's not bound because what does the binding theory say? You have to be bound within your governing category. The definition of binding is A binds B. I should have put that here, right? A binds B if and only if co-indexed arguments and a C command. So C command fails here, right? So we've got another problem with binding theory that doesn't work well, right? Doesn't get the job done. And it's not. And then in this case, with something like this, there is no good solution other than to go outside of binding theory, and then you need some kind of possibility for long distance reflexives that you state in terms of point of view. So here we're talking about, so notice that if we say Kramer's mailman, we're not talking about Kramer's point of view at all. We're talking about Kramer's mailman knows, blah, blah, blah. We're talking about what Newman knows. So we're thinking of Newman's point of view in that structure, right? But in this structure, Kramer's hope is blah, 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 right? Then what we're bringing to mind, or what we're talking about, is Kramer's state of mind, Kramer's emotions, Kramer's point of view. If we're talking about his hopes, it's as if we're saying that we're inside of his head. We know what Kramer wants, what Kramer hopes. And so therefore Kramer's point of view is that issue. And that's the thing that allows the reflexive here. So there are reflexives that simply the bottom line is don't need to be bound. And if you set it up right, where you're a reflexive that doesn't need to be bound, or you're in a situation where you don't need to be bound, then you look for something else, right? You look for the closest subject, or you look for a point of view argument. Okay. We could also do like this, right? It may be that a picture, over here, I guess this is it may be that a picture of her in a swimsuit won't shock you. Is that okay? That's what we would expect, right? Because so we're looking, here we've got her taking Elaine as its antecedent, right? So we're co-indexing Elaine and her. And her is a pronoun that cannot be bound in its governing category. Is Elaine in its governing category? It's in the governing category for that pronoun, right? But Elaine doesn't C-command her, right? Does not C-command, because what does Elaine C-command? Elaine C-commands nothing but the verb, right? There's nothing else, right? We look for the first branching node above me, the V bar. Is there anything there? Well, yeah, there's the V. So sisters of each other C-command each other. That's another way of defining sister, right? Two things that are in a mutual C-command relationship. But so Elaine doesn't C-command her. We expect that a pronoun would be okay there, and it is, right? But we also expect that a reflexive pronoun won't be okay here, right? But it kind of is, right? It may be that a picture of herself in a swimsuit won't shock Elaine. Seems okay, right? Well, what's going on here? Well, the solution is that so we have a reflexive pronoun that violates principle A. Why? What the solution is? It's because here we've got Elaine's point of view is what's at issue, right? All we're talking about here is what will shock Elaine and what won't shock Elaine. So what we're bringing to mind is Elaine's set of emotions or feelings or thoughts about some scenario, and so therefore it works. Okay, so that's classic binding theory. Now what I said was I'll show you now. So and I showed you some problems with it, right? Where it doesn't work, but in some cases it just doesn't work. And in other cases, you can get it to work by using the same thing that we did before. That you have to take into account, and for reflexives that don't have any argument that could be binding them, you take into account other things besides structure. You have to take into account either find the closest subject or the point of view. Okay, so here we go back to a simpler situation, right? So we've got Elaine talks to herself. That's fine. The governor of herself is to, so a preposition will govern its complement. A head will govern its complement position. To is a complement, is a head, a preposition. The first dominating IP is that. We've got an accessible subject. And so it's okay to put herself there, right? And not okay to put her. In co-argument binding theory, it works also, right? We've got Elaine and herself are semantic co-arguments. Because why? Talks takes as arguments. Its argument structure would be such that there is someone talked to would be there's the person that communicates something, right? And there's a recipient, there's a message giver, and a message receiver. Speaker and an addressee in all of these verbs of communication scenarios, right? So those are semantic co-arguments, and we expect that a reflexive pronoun must be bound by a preceding co-argument if it has a co-argument, right? And so that's what we expected. We would expect that a pronoun would not be okay there. And if we do something like this, Elaine mailed the package to herself. Mailed is a verb of transmission, of sending, and those verbs like that have two complements. So we could put them in a situation like this. Again, for classic binding theory, we're really not worrying about argumenthood, or if we're worrying about it, it's only in a roundabout way, through the notion of government. And things that govern other things are typically things that have those as their argument. So it's a roundabout way of the same thing. But we've got, we get what we expect here, right? So again, Elaine mailed the package to herself is okay. We've got you can see there's what we might do as the lexical conceptual structure. Someone acts on something causing it to go, or someone acts causing something to go, in the case of mail, via mail, right, to some place or someone, right? And so therefore, all we need here is really for these things to be semantic co-arguments. That's good enough. We're not selective about it. They're not, technically, they might not be syntactic co-arguments, but all that we need is for them to be semantic coarguments. Okay, Elaine put the groceries on the counter. Would have a structure like this, right? Where, again, if we have something in the on position, or the complement of on, and so the direct object, the complement of on, and the subject of this clause should all be in the same governing category, because there is governors and accessible subjects, and these things should all be semantic coarguments by the same token, right? Or by a little bit different token, right? That we've got the verb put has three semantic arguments: a place argument, a thing that goes to, so there's something that the person does, or a thing does, right? Causing, it does something to something, causing it to go to some place, right? That's what put is all about. Put involves three entities. It's an action involving three entities, and in fact, in this case, the complements are both required. They both have to be there with put. You can't just say, Elaine put the groceries out of the clear blue sky. You're missing something. All three of those things have to be there. So we've clearly got a case where we've got what appear to be semantic coarguments. Now, however, it's possible to construct sentences with put in such a way as to preclude herself taking Elaine as its antecedent, right? So we've got a problem here, right? If these are, if herself, the governing category for that DP, where we now have a choice, we're saying her or herself, which one do we get, right? We expect to be able to get herself. Classic binding theory predicts that we would get herself here, right? Because why? Because, well, my governor is behind. Elaine is an accessible subject. Those things are both contained within the first dominating IP node above me, right? And so this should be okay, but surprisingly, we get her instead, right? Elaine put the memories behind her, rather than, I need you to put those memories behind you. Elaine needs to put the memories behind her, right? Not Elaine needs to put the memories behind herself. It's weird, right? So we've got a problem. Her is bound in its governing category if we use her in apparent violation of principle B, and herself is disallowed in spite of the fact that, herself is disallowed in spite of the fact that principle A sanctions it, right? So classic binding theory sucks with respect to that. Apparently, right? There's going to be a solution, right? There's got to be, but we've got the same problem with co-argument binding theory, right? We've got her is bound by a co-argument in apparent violation, apparently, in apparent violation of principle B, and herself is disallowed in spite of the fact that principle A sanctions it because Elaine is preceding co-argument if these things are arguments of the verb and so forth, right? So, and it turns out that this is systematic. It's not just a random case. You can set this up with a whole bunch of verbs of this kind and with different sorts of prepositions and so forth. So Kramer keeps his memories to him. Or it's systematic in the there's a systematicity about it, right? So keeps his memories to himself is okay, but Kramer, so notice it's interesting, right? Kramer keeps his memories to himself, but Kramer pushes people away from him, not away from himself, right? I put my laptop down next to me, it's fine, right? I put my laptop down next to myself, is weird, right? And I drop my keys behind me, was okay, but not with myself. So it's okay with keep memories to oneself, but bad with keep laptop with herself. Elaine always keeps her laptop with herself. It's weird, right? Always keeps her laptop with her. So I have $5 on myself. I have $5 on myself. Is that good? No, I have $5 on me, right? So there's a bunch of these cases where we can set up and we get the same thing. Jerry saw something in front of him. Jerry saw something in front of himself. No, right? Okay, so we need to fix this, right? And we're going to figure out a way of doing this. And we could use this. What we want to do is to use this thing that we already need, right? We want to say that reflexive pronoun doesn't have anything that can bind it because it doesn't have any co-argument. And if it doesn't have any co-arguments, then what we would expect is it's going to look for the closest subject. Right? So that's what we want to do. That's going to be the task in front of us. So we want to say that the place argument of verbs like put can be realized as a prepositional phrase that has its own internal argument structure. So what we want to say is that behind is really a predicate. Behind is a predicate unlike to. To doesn't do this. When you have keep his memories to himself, right? To doesn't do that. But there's a difference between to and these other ones, right? To is very vague and doesn't have a real heavy meaning, right? It's just there because it's really very bleached in terms of meaning. But things like behind and in front of and those other kinds of things are all very semantically rich prepositions, and so we want to say that those things have internal argument structure of some kind. Next to me. So what are you going to say, really? We're going to say that we want to have some way of doing it that way, that they have their own internal argument structure, but we'll not go there today. We're going to go there. We're going to go there after taking a look at. So the next step is this, right? We see we've got a problem, right? We see we've got a way of maybe fixing it, or we've got an intuition behind how the fixing would happen. And so we need to flesh out the theory in order to make that happen. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take the theory that we've been working in down a road that will make it more complex and more abstract. We're not going to be worrying about binding theory anymore. That's part of the piece, one part of the whole puzzle. Historically, this is what happened, right? Is that you start out saying, well, here's how phrase structure must work. We've got tests for constituency. We see how the trees work and so forth. Now let's account for the phenomena. We've got this reflexive anaphora, and we know that it's something like two things in the same clause, but they have to be in a situation of a certain kind of configuration. And so we develop a whole theory for that, right? And then we take it as far as we can, and we go and we see, well, wait a minute, it's not quite working. There's some problems with it. So then what do we want to do? We want to say, well, we've got to fix it, right? And so we're going to fix it, but we're going to first start out by talking about something about the history of theories, to sort of put all of this in some kind of context. So we have two kinds of basic theories of syntax. I'm going to give you some samples of other flavors of theory. without going into detail about them. But one of them, according to one kind of theory, syntax and semantics are all one thing. There's only one creature there. You don't have them separate. And the other kind, or classic transformational grammar in the form of generative semantics, would be one version of such a theory. There was a time during which this theory was developing when these things, in fact, this reflex of anaphora started to be seen. And people started saying, well, we need to have trees that have more stuff in them, and we're just going to put the whole semantics into the tree. Syntactic structure is related to, but distinct from semantic structure. That's the other flavor of theory. And the way that the model that we've been looking at has been a model of that kind. So the standard version of transformational grammar, roughly in 1970, Chomsky and Ray Jackendoff was his hero. Ray Jackendoff wrote a dissertation where he defended the view that syntax and semantics should be kept separate. There's a semantic theory, and it's related to the syntactic structure, and they interact, but those things are separate. And that's something that holds all the way through government and binding theory. So that was part of that, the binding theory that we just looked at was the government and binding theory version. And in principles and parameters model, the principles and parameters model, which is what we've been working with, some version of that principles and parameters model, which allowed things like co-argument binding theory and so forth. And then you have other theories that broke off from transformational grammar fairly early on. These were student of Chomsky's, created a version of standard theory in which semantics and syntax were separate, two different enterprises. It differed from the standard theory in not having transformational structures. You didn't move things in trees, was basically what you did. Okay, and then you have role and reference grammar that some of you have learned about in 103B. That was the model that was being used. You have then on the other side of the equation, you have, and all of these things are things that developed in contraposition to, or mostly by people that broke off from the standard theory for one reason or another and developed another version of theory. So cognitive grammar was a version of theory that was developed by one of the people that was in the generative semantics. And I'm going to show you some examples of these things in a minute. Generative semantics theory that was starting to put, let's get all of the syntax and semantics together in one representation. And in order to do that, we're going to have pretty crazy big representations and so forth. And one of the people that was in that movement was Ronald Laniker, and he broke off together with George Lakoff. They started doing some stuff, and they started something called cognitive linguistics. And cognitive grammar was a version of a theory of grammar that dealt with syntax, but it was all just about semantics. Everything was a semantic representation. And then what happens is that the principles and parameters model of standard that developed out of the standard version of transformational grammar ends up going back to, in some sense, going back to the older model, the generative semantics model, where the trees are hella big and they've got all kinds of abstract stuff in them, and it's just meaning. And meaning and syntax are all one thing. The representation is all of just that one thing. So there's a kind of weird development of theories. Chomsky takes one stance. Syntax and semantics are separate. You remember there's this idea that there's this autonomous syntax. There are principles of structure that are part of the human endowment And there's a language acquisition device that's concerned only about syntactic structure. That's autonomous, not the same as meaning or concepts and all of that. All right, so that's and then so then there are other theories that do all of this kind of thing. So role and reference grammar has different syntax, right? The representations for clauses are quite different. There are no verb phrases. There's a kind of conception of clause structure as being something built around predicates. So you have predicates that are verbs usually, but in some languages they wouldn't be verbs. They could be other categories of things. And there's a nucleus around which sentences are built. And then there are these core elements that are going to be usually arguments. And the arguments are going to be determined by something in the lexicon. There'd be a lexical entry for verbs. So the verb smash would have a lexical entry like this. Is like sort of like the things we've been using for saying you've got to have a meaning. The meaning is part of the lexical entry. And role and reference grammar had one kind of way of doing this that has the cause and become, and you can see that the formula is a little bit different from what we've been using, right? We just followed someone from the principles and parameters model that was doing something very simple. So there's a lexical conceptual structure. Call it logical structure in role and reference grammar, but it's the same thing, right? It's some kind of representation of the meaning of things. And then you have rules for mapping from the lexical conceptual structure or logical structure to the syntactic structure. And the rules say things like, oh, well, one of those arguments in the lexical conceptual structure will be the actor, and another one will be the undergrower. So there are these basic semantic roles. And then there are rules for where those go in the structure. And then we can go from the syntactic structure to the fleshed out representation of the meaning of the clause, right? So here, notice what we're doing. We're keeping the semantics, and they're different. In role and reference grammar, for a sentence, there are different planes of representation. And this is only some of them, right? There are other ones as well. There's the plane that would give you the info. It would be called something else. It would be called an operator, a tense operator. So there's a projection out of the clause that goes in. So it's like role and reference grammar has a bunch of different representations of clauses on different planes. And you can't even draw them on the screen because they're coming out in different angles, right, for those of you. So that's one kind of theory, right? Cognitive grammar says it's all images. Everything is basically imagistic. And everything is just concepts. And concepts are grammar. And so the representation for wash would be something like this, believe it or not. A picture like this, and it's got things that correspond to the role and reference grammar actor undergoer. So trajector, TR stands for trajector, that's like actor. Landmark is like undergoer. It's like so this is based on some kind of cognitive psychology where you've got typically a figure in a ground, and the thing that you're focusing on in some way is the figure, and the other thing is the ground, and we'll call those trajector and landmark, yeah. What's that?
Like, how do you have your love?
Well, yeah, so this theory has its challenges, right? But where it has virtues is that the reason that it's done this way is that there are reasons to believe that the linguistic system and the conceptual system in general is parasitic on, or based on, or involves extensions of a kind of thinking that is fundamentally spatial. So we think of things in terms of, because that's what's most concrete. the relationship between things in the world and their locations. And all of that stuff we understand fairly well. And we have rich vocabulary for talking about those things. And so, in fact, this was early on, it was called space grammar. And then people thought, well, that's a bad name. Then you think of spacey grammar, right? But it was space grammar because it was about how things in space work, right? And so then what you do is then understand everything in terms of that, and everything else is a metaphorical extension from it. Essentially, that's the basic idea. But yeah, you're not going to be able to draw a picture of love, right? So you don't just have pictures, right? I shouldn't have said that. There are concepts. And you would have, so in this theory, all there are concepts, human concepts, right? And those concepts are structured in certain ways that yield grammar. And the notion image goes beyond graphic image, right? So image schemas, so it's going to be, this is done in terms of image schemas. And image schemas can be abstract things that that you can't picture, right? So things that you experience, that's at some level, and there's an image schema for that experience. You just can't draw it. Does that make sense? Okay, so you draw the things that you can, and don't do the others. So there's this all this stuff. This is drawn in such a way. So someone acts volitionally. It's got some things in there on something. I'm doing wash just because I happen to have pictures of it. I did this for some reason, I don't even know why. Using water, because that's part of the concept, right? You can't wash something if water's not part of it, right? So, and the images are meant to show something about the nature, the internal structure of those objects and so forth. And dirt moves off, right? If you don't put this all in, right? So really what this is, well, you could do that in the kinds of lexical conceptual structures that we've been using, right? X acts on something, that causes cause, and then you have to have something kind of crazy like be dirt off, so, or something. So the Lancaster just says, well, just draw a picture. And then there's a speaker and there's a car, and if we can add those, we can have those be fleshed out by different things, and we get the whole thing. I washed the car, and we've just got nothing but it's just meaning. There's the meaning. There's the picture of the meaning, and that's all there is to grammar. Is the claim. So that's cognitive grammar. I don't know what I did here. So this would be generative transformational grammar with interpretive semantics. This is the standard theory. You'd have Floyd broke the vase, would have a simple syntactic structure and has one of these lexical entries with all of that stuff. Instead of saying there's an actor and undergoer, there's a verb that has an NP object. And that counts as being the undergoer or patient and so forth, right? And then you've got transformational rules. There would be a rule called affix hopping, and there'd be more phonological rules, and you end up with Floyd broke the vase because id jumped onto. So right, very early on in transformational grammar, this idea that there was an info was there. Tense is an auxiliary. Tense, and we represent it as id. And there's going to be a transformation. And so there's a level of abstractness. And the id will combine with break in the syntax. And that'll cause some phonological rules to occur, morphophonological rules. And break plus id gets spelled out as broke, right? So all of that's part of, so there's some syntactic transformations going on there. But the semantics is kept separate. And you get and this develops into the kind of theory where we're at right now in some sense. What we'll do next time is then come back and start to look at where where it's going to go and how this theory starts to become more like cognitive grammar and generative semantics and starts to have just the semantics and syntax be all one thing. That's where we're headed. Okay.